Welcome to my presentation. I'd like to start by thanking the conveners for inviting me to present in this session. I'm going to talk about some work we've been doing looking at the carbon cycle of Southeast Australia during 2019 and 2020, when there was a large drought and large biomass burning events. This work is a collaboration of scientists at JPL, Caltech, NASA Goddard, in New Zealand at NIWA, and in Australia at the University of Wollongong. 2019 was the hottest and driest year in recorded history in Australia, and as was widely reported in the news media, these warm, dry conditions led to very large biomass burning events in the southeast of Australia from November 2019 through January 2020. So in this study, we want to look at what carbon cycle observations can tell us about this event. In terms of both the biomass burning emissions and anomalies in net ecosystem exchange. So if you're like me, you probably don't have very good understanding of the geography of Southeast Australia. So for a little bit of context, this box here is showing our domain of interest. This region is quite temperate along the coast, supporting a lot of evergreen broadleaf forests. A little further inland is more mountainous, particularly in the south, supporting a lot of evergreen needleleaf forests. Then as you move further inland, conditions become drier and seasonally hotter, and the forests give way to cropland, grassland, savanna, and shrubland ecosystems. This region has kind of a southern extratropical seasonal cycle where the productivity more inland peaks in the spring, and then in the forested region peaks in the austral summer. In this study, we use a bottom-up approach where we use carbon cycle observations to model the CO2 flux anomalies. We then evaluate these estimates of CO2 flux anomalies against top-down observations of atmospheric CO2. For biomass burning, we use TROPOMI XCO measurements to infer a biomass burning CO emission, which we then convert to a CO2 flux from biomass burning. For net ecosystem exchange, we use MODIS-based GPP observations to first infer a GPP anomaly over the event and then convert this to a net ecosystem exchange anomaly. The net CO2 anomaly flux is then evaluated against a CO2 anomaly flux inferred from the atmospheric CO2 observations. This is an extension of the approach developed by Yin et al. And is presented at this meeting in abstract B00709. We estimate the CO emissions from the TROPOMI XCO data by performing a high-resolution flux inversion over an Australian domain shown in this lower right-hand corner. This is done over the main phase of the event from November through January. In this inversion, we first perform a global flux inversion to get boundary conditions for this nested domain, and then run a high-resolution inversion at 1/2 degree by 2/3 degree spatial resolution. We estimate CO emissions using two different prior estimates, one from the GFED and one from GFAS. Here I'm going to show some movies of the TROPOMI XCO measurements, of the simulated XCO measurements using the mean prior flux, the difference between TROPOMI and the prior simulated CO, the posterior simulated XCO, and the difference between TROPOMI observations in the posterior. So what you can see in this movie is that there's a lot of mismatch due to the inability of the high-resolution model to represent the biomass burning plume. But despite this, we can see that in general, the prior emissions are too low in that we get a higher XCO for the TROPOMI observations than the prior where the plume is occurring. And for this reason, the posterior fluxes are scaled up relative to the prior. So this plot shows the CO emissions as a function of time in Southeast Australia. Now we see in the dark grays the posterior emissions, which are scaled up relative to the prior emissions. And we end up having posterior emissions of 15 to 29 teragrams of CO over this period, relative to prior estimate of 6 to 12 teragrams carbon of CO. We also find that these posterior estimates both fit the TROPOMI data better and compared better with two nearby TCON sites at Wollongong and Lauder. This is particularly true when we look at the air mass sensitive to biomass burning emissions, where we see a large reduction in the posterior data model mismatch. We then convert the CO emissions to CO2 emissions using the GFAS and GFED emission factors and downscale these to 0.1 by 0.1 degree spatial resolution using the GFAS inventory. So now I'm going to turn to how we model our net ecosystem exchange anomaly. So for this, we use FluxAt GPP, which is based on MODIS reflectances and is calibrated against FluxNet GPP estimates. We calculate a GPP anomaly for 2019-2020 relative to a 2010 through 2018 baseline. We then take the NE anomaly to be assumed to be a fraction of the GPP anomaly. Here we assume it to be in the range of 30 to 50% of the GPP anomaly. All right, now that we have estimates of productivity and biomass burning, we can look at how the event proceeds over time. Here I'm going to show an animation of ERA 5 monthly soil temperature and soil moisture, as well as the daily FluxAt GPP estimates and biomass burning over Southeast Australia. This top row is showing the climatological values over 2010 through 2018, while the second row is showing the 2019-2020 values, while the bottom is showing the anomalies for 2020 relative to the climatological values. So you can see that through October and November, you have warm, dry conditions leading to below average productivity and some biomass burning events. This persists through December and January, leading to the largest biomass burning events towards the end of December and early January, as you can see here. Right? Throughout this entire period, we're seeing suppressed productivity. But towards the end of January into February, we see conditions reversing where you have below average temperatures and wetter conditions. This leads to a suppression of biomass burning and a large recovery over much of the domain. And we actually see above average productivity through the austral fall. And so we see these two steps. First, we have these warm, dry conditions with a lot of carbon loss, and then we see a bit of a recovery through the fall when wetter, cooler conditions prevail. So here I'm showing the kind of two periods of this growing season where you have these warm, dry conditions for October, January, leading to suppressed productivity. And then you have a bit of recovery through the late summer and fall with cooler, wetter conditions. Now, when we look at this recovery, we see that it is generally widespread, but there are some areas that do not recover at all. And these align very closely with the distribution of biomass burning events. So now we're interested in looking at, how does the carbon cycle perturbations occur inside these biomass burning events and outside the biomass burning events. So now we look at the carbon cycle anomalies for 5 different regions. We aggregate the cropland, grassland, savanna, and shrubland ecosystems into this blue region while looking at the evergreen needleleaf forests and evergreen broadleaf forests in both the unburnt and burnt areas. These time series on the bottom are showing GPP as a function of time of the year and biomass burning as a function of time of the year for these 5 different regions. For GPP, the black line shows the climatology, while the red line shows the 2019-2020 productivity. We see in the cropland and grassland shrublands, we have this large suppression of productivity during the warm, dry conditions, but a strong recovery in the fall when cooler, wetter conditions prevail. For the unburned forested regions, we see reduced productivity during the spring and summer, but recovery to mean conditions during the fall when conditions improve. However, in the burned regions, we see much further suppressed productivity during the warm, dry conditions, and then continued suppressed productivity during the recovery period relative to the unburned forest. Now, if we look at the total carbon flux anomalies over these different regions shown here, for both the net ecosystem exchange and biomass burning, we see that carbon loss in the cropland, grassland, savanna, and shrubland is much smaller given the large area and is dominated by productivity loss. Whereas for both forest regions, the loss of carbon is really dominated by these large biomass burning events. And in total, we estimate that 139 to 241 teragrams of CO2 are lost through biomass burning, and 36 to 52 teragrams of carbon are lost through reduced productivity over Southeast Australia during this period. So now we want to evaluate our bottom-up estimates against atmospheric CO2 observations. So to do this, we first need to construct anomalies in atmospheric CO2 due to fluxes. For this, we estimate a climatological set of net ecosystem exchange fluxes by performing a CO2 flux inversion over 2010 through 2018. We then apply these climatological net ecosystem exchange fluxes with year-specific fossil fuel emissions to simulate what we expect atmospheric CO2 to be for 2019-2020. Then, based off the difference between the actual observations from OCO2 or TCON sites and our expected observations given climatological fluxes, we can quantify an anomaly in atmospheric CO2. So now we want to test whether our inferred top-down anomalies in atmospheric CO2 can be explained by our inferred bottom-up CO2 flux anomalies. To do this, we take our CO2 bottom-up flux anomalies and apply them to the surface of a chemical transport model and simulate an atmospheric CO2 anomaly signal. So I'm going to show a movie here of the anomalies as observed by OCO2 from our top-down approach and the bottom-up approach. And on the right, I'm showing the top-down CO2 anomalies against the bottom-up CO2 anomalies. And so basically, we want to see if the CO2 flux anomalies from our bottom-up approach are able to explain the atmospheric CO2 anomaly signal inferred from our top-down approach. If this is the case, then the anomaly should roughly fall along this 1-to-1 line. And although we see a lot of scatter because we're close to the precision of OCO2, this generally is the case, that they fall along this line. So now we look in more detail at our top-down versus bottom-up CO2 anomaly signals. Here we look separately at OCO2 land and ocean data over this domain shown down here, as well as at Wollongong and Louder TCON sites. So we plot these anomalies on a grid and color them by the number of observations per grid cell. We then calculate mean and standard deviations at 0.2 ppm intervals from the bottom-up estimates, and then perform a linear regression on these points. Although there's quite a lot of scatter and we see some differences in the slope, in general, the slope is quite close to this 1-to-1 line. And so here we can conclude that our top-down constraints support our estimates of CO2 flux anomalies from our bottom-up analysis. In conclusion, we see that these different carbon cycle observations paint a coherent picture of the impacts of drought and biomass burning events on Southeast Australia during 2019-2020. We find that these events leads to a large efflux of carbon of 175 to 293 teragrams C of CO2. And this is large even compared to Australia's annual fossil fuel emissions of 115 teragrams C. We find that when cooler, wetter conditions return, most of the ecosystems return to average or above average productivity, but the burned forests remain with lower productivity throughout the growing season, suggesting a slow recovery ahead. Thank you for your attention.